next panel is addressing some very important and difficult issues. We will call it more a fireside chat because we want to make it somewhat informal, get the audience participate as well. The moderator is Judy Holtzman, who is a Senior Managing Partner, Longevity Venture Advisors, LLC. Judy has a very interesting biography, and that makes this individual highly credible for what we're trying to do. He's a founder and the managing partner of Longevity Venture Advisors, where we work with a lot of innovative entrepreneurs throughout the US, VCs, public company, and non-for-profit organization, to leverage business and investments in the close to $8 billion longevity economy, which is rapidly growing. He's a recognized expert and a well-known thought leader on innovation in the aging space. In fact, very recently, in honor of his contribution, was recognized by the top 50 influencers in aging by the NPR Aging by Next Avenue. Judy was previously AARP Senior Vice President of Market Innovations, which gave him a lot of exposure to what we are doing here in this conference. He also conceived and built the first program to spark innovation in the market that benefits people over 50. And as we mentioned earlier, there's clearly not enough money in the political system at the national, at the senior level to pay for those programs, so we're looking more for those things. What we are going to focus on in the spirit of time in this important fireside chat is on leveraging data to optimize value-based care and improve health outcome. I'm very curious to see what everybody has to say. Please give a big hand to our panelists.
So I'm not going to get deeply into the bios because you can read those in the brochure. But with us today are Carolyn McGill, CEO of Aetion, and she will tell you how it is they came up with that name. A branding agency's opportunity. And Dan Gebremedin, who's a principal with Flair Capital, an early stage healthcare venture firm. So we have a very interesting and complex concept behind this title, leveraging real-world data to optimize value-based care and improve health outcomes. So Carolyn, why don't you start with just how that thinking relates to what Aetion is doing and kind of where the potential is.
Absolutely. So first we should start by explaining real-world data. And it's interesting actually within the context of healthcare that we feel compelled to use that qualifier, that it's real world. Ultimately, we generally use this phrase to refer to what happens to us in our everyday lives as we experience clinical interventions, as we take medications. This contrasts with what happens during things like randomized clinical studies, where in a trial setting, we have a very controlled environment with physicians and other care providers that are monitoring patient adherence rates and things that may not be so pristine once a clinical trial ends and we administer these clinical interventions, medications and the like in what we call the real world. Aetion's role in this is using real-world evidence to advance understanding of the safety, efficacy, and value of clinical interventions. We do this with a technology platform that looks to assess the causal impact of a given intervention on a specific population.
And so where's the data coming from? Whose data is it? Is it identified, de-identified? What's the source?
Well, so one of the most important aspects of real-world data is to have a comprehensive view of the patient experience. And this means that we take claims data, electronic medical record data, it could be patient-reported outcomes, it could be data from social media. We take data from all different kinds of sources, and we look at that in a real-time way to try to assess how a patient is actually responding to given clinical interventions. It can be de-identified if we're asking questions at a population level. So imagine we're trying to construct a value-based care arrangement as an example, and we want to understand the implications for a specific patient cohort, people with given chronic illnesses as an example. In other instances, when we work with payers as an example, the health insurance companies want to have very specific information about how given providers are behaving, how their patients are responding, so that then they can tailor clinical outreach and interventions specific to those individuals enrolled in their plans. So we do both.
So I like to think of strategy as kind of coming down to three questions. What are you going to sell? Who are you going to sell to? Why should anybody buy from you and not the other guy? So we kind of have a general idea of what you're selling. Who are the buyers? Why you? Given the landscape that's out there, I'm so glad we're no longer using the phrase big data. What that shows is that there are these fads that come along, and it may all mean different nomenclature for the same exact thing over time, but we still have a lot of competition out there. So how do you differentiate?
Well, just as an aside, I love hearing you say that because I have felt over the last 20 years a little bit like Goldilocks, where I've put on the payer hat, put on the provider hat, I put on the bundled payment hat, and all the time feeling like we weren't necessarily getting to systemic change. And that has actually come full circle for me to the data world and understanding that we have to use science, we have to be very thoughtful about assessing things like safety and efficacy and value, how we define that, using consistent terms and the like, and using data in a scientific way helps us do that. Aetion differentiates within the world of data analytics in a couple of meaningful ways. One relates to the longitudinal patient view that we take into account. We think about patients with respect to intervals of time, not points in time. And I could get much more in the weeds on explaining why that's integral to the kinds of analyses that are completed on our platform. Suffice it to say that it's important to look at patients holistically and to understand exactly what's happening to them over the course of a treatment period, given multiple chronic illnesses and multiple psychosocial factors that could have an impact on them.
So I warned you I was going to interrupt.
Please, I love that.
So you focus on the individual. We heard in previous panel, Charlotte and Nora and the other guys, talking about talking about the individual from a holistic sense. Well, one of the key things is thinking about social determinants of health at the level of an N of 1. So are those data also part of this?
Well, what we find is that we look at different sample sizes to create views of patient cohorts. So absolutely, data at an N of 1, and that's what's most important for a clinical intervention. But when we have the right data sets, we can actually aggregate that, or we can create cohorts who experience patterns of care that we can then recognize and understand how best to support.
Great. Dan, so as an investor in Aetion, you and your colleagues at Flare, I assume are investing against an investment thesis. You're kind of looking at it within the context of trends, whether it's from fee-for-service to value-based models, other kind of big mega trends shaping the healthcare landscape. Pull it all together for us, and why? What is it about Aetion that kind of said, yeah, we want to ride that one?
No, thank you, Jody, and one of my colleagues from Flare Capital, Bill Geary, who actually led the investment in Aetion, is here, so I have to acknowledge him. Just to talk a little bit about Flare Capital, just to provide context for our investment in Aetion. Flare is a $200 million fund. We only invest in early stage healthcare technology and services companies. We've raised a significant amount of capital from large healthcare corporations, payers, providers, PBMs. So we have a very, very focused view around the enterprise within healthcare. And if there's an underlying theme that ties all of our portfolio companies together, it's transforming business models as we shift to value-based care. And when you think about value-based care, really, what does that mean? It means having skin in the game, right? I think for the longest time, providers have provided services without any kind of semblance on what's actually going to happen to the patient after I provide that service to the patient. And we've seen this, providers now moving to value-based care, payers helping providers move to value-based care. And a couple of years ago, when we actually met some of the founders of Aetion, we were struck with the fact that what about industry? What about pharma? Right? How come they don't have skin in the game? And it's going to be a slow transition, but we actually believe that at some point in the near term, industry, not just pharma, but all forms of kind of manufacturers will actually have to deliver outcomes. They can't just deliver products, they can't just deliver services, they're gonna have to deliver outcomes. And in order to actually track whether or not, how well your skin is doing, you need data, right? And so that's what the Aetion, kind of platform provides. It allows a conversation between all of the different stakeholders in healthcare with how are our outcomes, how are we actually doing? And if we're going to tie payments to that, let's all agree.
So I would think pharma would push back on that though and say, what do you mean we don't generate outcomes? You take our pill, people, somebody lives, they don't take our pill, not so good. So what is the dynamic in that conversation with pharma? I'm curious.
Yeah, so before I was at Flare, I worked at a payer. I worked at Harvard Pilgrim. I was a medical director focused on population health analytics and general strategy, and I was in charge of value-based purchasing at the height of the biologics kind of craze, right? We have probably 5 different biologics that all treat different forms of inflammatory conditions. And so when you have these kind of Me Too drugs, ultimately you have to determine, are you actually getting value? So if a drug costs $20,000 and the promise is that this is actually going to reduce hospitalizations, if you don't actually check to see if it reduces hospitalizations, you'll never really know if you're getting value for the interventions, the expensive interventions that you're producing, right? You're intervening on patients. And so I think it's really, really important. And I think pharma understands. And from a positioning perspective, you can actually argue that it's actually going to be a competitive differentiator, that the rules of the game may change. You actually may need to have real-world evidence. You actually may need to have outcomes-based contracts and actually get onto the formulary of a payer to reach these large populations.
Yeah,
and so,
the trick there, Jody, is just understanding that there are nuances within a patient population. So when we think about the aging population, which is underrepresented in randomized clinical trials as an example, and studies, right? It is even bulked in a way that doesn't necessarily reflect individual needs within an aging population. So from a biopharma perspective, our clients are saying, we want to understand what those subpopulations are, where our drug might be most effective, or where is there actually an unmet need in the population that we haven't yet even identified yet, and that's where real-world evidence can be helpful.
So play that out for people. So either pharma or a payer, contracts with you. Walk us through kind of a day in the life. And what is that better outcome, and what form does it take?
Absolutely. So from a biopharma perspective, they are using our platform across the spectrum of drug development. In the early stages of development, they're trying to understand where is there an unmet need and how might they shape their molecules in a way to address that unmet need. As drugs come closer to coming to the market, or they're even on the market, they're trying to understand how best to reach the subpopulations that could be best served. And they're also trying to understand the progression of disease. How do we identify things? If you take a rheumatoid arthritis population as an example, how do we identify whether a drug is actually improving their quality of life? Where does that get captured in claims data? How is that represented in EMR data, right? Those are the kinds of questions that are quite complicated, and we need to partner with them to assess even what data sets are available to answer these questions. Also, how to structure the queries and the studies in a way that are reliable and they're transparent. At the end of every study you run on our platform, the system generates a report, 200, 300 pages, depending on the complexity of what you've just run, that lists out all the assumptions you've made. So important to have that transparency. What did you mean by diagnosis? What did you mean by on a drug for a year? What did you mean by prescription date, prescription fill date, or when it was prescribed? From a payer perspective, we find that payers are looking to better understand whether the drugs that are on their formulary are truly best serving their populations. We recently did an analysis for a client where they were looking at therapies for diabetes patients. And they found that the second-line therapy was twice as expensive as the first-line therapy, and so they did that in a progression in a deliberate way. When we did our analysis, we realized that for a subset of the population, you actually have a better impact on the total cost of care by adopting that second-line therapy at 2x the price as a first-line therapy for that population. Mind-blowing, really necessary to understand who are those patients and what do they actually need and why is this drug more efficacious in that context. And then the last thing I'll add is that Aetion has become the only built-for-purpose platform specific to creating a neutral place for biopharma organizations and for payers to analyze these data in a consistent way and have a conversation about things like outcomes-based contracts.
And so you're suggesting that the payers actually do have an interest in these better health outcomes, and that's a bigger driver than the discount that they're getting from a PBM and an individual pharma company to say, no, that's tier 1, not tier 3, and da-da-da-da.
This is where I get fired up, Jody. I spent nearly a decade at United Health Group and led special needs plans, so Medicare Advantage products for vulnerable populations, people with chronic illnesses, people with limited incomes. And I'm afraid that we love to paint payers in this sort of big bad light at times. And I can tell you that we absolutely—
She gave me $20 for this.
We absolutely care about the impact to the total cost of care. One of the challenges that we have when we're sitting in that seat of managing health plans relates to the tools that we have at our disposal. And oftentimes we're thinking, oh, here's a population with multiple chronic illnesses. They're not seeking appropriate care. They're not adherent to their drug medications. Okay, let's give them support. We'll start calling them. And when we're calling them 4 times a year and that doesn't work, we say, oh, okay, we'll call them 12 times a year. And when that doesn't work, we say, okay, we'll put a nurse in the doctor's office. And if that doesn't work, we'll put an NP in their home. And the next thing you know, we've expended all of these resources because common sense tells us that more support is better for people, but it doesn't necessarily yield increased outcomes or improvement in health outcomes. So being able to take a step back and assess, what does it mean for this subset of the population to have this clinical intervention? Does it actually work? When does it work? When doesn't it? And how much is it worth to us to switch to this clinical intervention rather than the status quo? That's the kind of data that real-world evidence can give us access to.
So every answer to every hypothesis that's proven, generates another question, and which is great. Makes it fun, and we all learn.
And Jody, you can see why we're so excited to have recruited Carolyn as CEO of Aetion.
So Dan, what in the experience that you've had as an investor, but also a player that influences really what happens in healthcare, whether things get funded or not. Where are the next big things? Not to pull the curtain back on Aetion's strategic plan, but what are the questions that keep coming up that others partnering, Aetion, yourselves, just say, yep, that's the next horizon. What is it? And how does it tie back to the issue of aging and the fact that a lot of disease, just correlates with age, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just such rapid amounts of innovation, in the healthcare system in the United States. We spent a lot of the day talking about, kind of software and services, technological innovation, but on the biopharma side, there's just drastic amounts of, innovation, specifically around individual therapeutics, that these therapeutics tend to be higher cost. I think we heard a statistic earlier this week that the average cost of a therapeutic that's being approved by the FDA is $150,000 right now. Right, and I know that the aging market oftentimes will be the market that these therapies are going to be created for. Dementia, for example, right? A lot of money going into that space, and there are a lot of things that we can do to patients, right? But we have to, as an enterprise, we have to understand where are you actually going to get a return? Where are you actually going to improve lives and improve outcomes? One of the things that we've talked a little bit about with older adults is that oftentimes they are a vulnerable population. Right? There is a significant amount of information asymmetry between what the patient understands and what the provider and the enterprises are actually doing to these patients. And so it's going to be a platform like Aetion that allows us to look at the gamut of interventions, whether it's a $50,000 a year drug or a social determinant, transportation, improved care coordination, Meals on Wheels. There are a variety of things that we can provide to patients, and we need a platform that determines where we're going to get the best ROI, and that actually not only kind of improves outcomes but also improves quality of life for patients.
Yeah, I think Meals on Wheels is in the
in
the audience.
That's
I saw
right.
Lucy.
Give him a plug, right?
Yeah. Hey, Luce. We used to work together. So Carolyn, what are kind of some of the challenges you face? So, particularly for startups getting into large organizations. I know when I was at AARP, it got to the point where I would say, to startups, forget it. Just don't even think about, a deal. You're going to end up in a Kafka novel, and at the end of it, what you have in hand is maybe. The worst possible outcome, not yes, not no, and by the way, come back on your nickel, across the country. So what are some of the challenges as a startup to, how you find partners of choice that enable you to kind of get the proof of concept, but also then to actually, change the world?
I like that. We are changing the world. We believe deeply in this mission. We have had a tremendous progression in working with our clients that are most interested in the science behind what we do. So what we have found is that the entree into this space has been through demonstrating the transparency our platform brings to the equation around using real-world evidence, the accelerated way that we can do analytics. Luckily, in the biopharma space in particular, and when we talk about things like pharmacoepidemiology, there is a dedication to science. And there is a belief that we want to get to the right answer as quickly as we can. And that provides an entree for a platform like Aetion's to come in and demonstrate, put our platform up against SaaS programmers, put our platform up against the other tools that you're using, and we can demonstrate for you why it's different. We have found that we've gotten faster traction and uptick in the biopharma space than we have within payers, as an example. I think payers have maybe more of the response that you've just described. Again, we prove it out through data and demonstrating, here's the ROI, here's what you can do more effectively for the patients that you're trying to serve, and we find that that gets attention.
Looking across not just Aetion, but other, portfolio companies that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I think the area that you're talking a little bit about is just this concept of customer segmentation. And it's an area that I think startups have varying degrees of difficulty with, because I think you look at a large enterprise, they have a high top line revenue number. Oh, they could be a great customer. And I reflect on something that I think Steve Jobs said, is that he's like solving problems that like no one knew that they had. I don't know that that necessarily works in healthcare, right. Specifically in healthcare enterprises. It's very hard to kind of get share of budget for something that is not a top priority for a healthcare organization. And I think the situation that Aetion is in this world of real-world evidence, biopharma understands that there's an opportunity here, and so it's a consultative sale. You not only need to kind of share the platform, but you actually have to show them how to use it and show all the different use cases. I think payers in the same light, and so I think it's really important for early stage companies to spend time with their customers. Understand where are the priorities of interest, where do they actually budget. When I was at the health plan at Harvard Pilgrim, we would budget 3 years in advance. So we knew what we were going to spend on 3 years in advance. And to get share of budget for something that we have not already prioritized is going to be really challenging. And I think what ends up happening for a lot of early stage companies that are coming up with great technologies is that these enterprises will say, oh, this is interesting, hey, let's pilot it, right? But there's no potential long-term purchase down the road until it becomes a priority, until it becomes a problem that is at the top of their stack, because these healthcare organizations, generally speaking, are so budget constrained, right? You have to have budget neutral solutions, you have to have near-term ROI within the calendar year in order to kind of get into the purchasing stack.
Right. So do you get into into biosimilars as well? And I remember at AARP that was a big issue. It was kind of like the generics and just a way to lower costs. And
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually an international consortium focused on biosimilars that we're very active in. And the work that we're doing with the FDA in a partnership to evaluate the opportunity for real-world evidence, as an example, to either supplement or even replace randomized clinical trials, which means that we can get biosimilars and other therapies to the market more quickly, is advancing at a great clip.
yeah, cool. So we kind of designed this that we would just have this conversation and you all would have the opportunity to eavesdrop. But now we're going to put you on the hook. And so open it up for questions, and hopefully my colleagues here will have answers. Don't all jump in at once.
Thank you. My name is Parker from F Prime Capital. Just a question about real-world use of data and moving away from RCTs. So are you looking at...
Could you explain the acronym?
Sorry, randomized controlled trials. I'm based in London, by the way. Fascinated in this space. It's a really good area. I'm just wondering whether you've looked at using your platform for adaptive trials and that more kind of statistical-based use of real-world data.
Yes, we have. And again, working with others in the industry to advance some of the standards and appreciating how real-world evidence can be used to support new approaches to evaluating safety and efficacy of medications and doing it in a quicker way. So there are lots of different forms that can take. And we think that there is a definite role, and as time goes by, as we're doing this partnership with the FDA as an example, we're able to advance the conversation and the understanding of what the data can tell us, because it's important to appreciate where it is comprehensive and where there may still be data that's lacking, right? So that we're judicious in terms of how we approach it.
Is the industry beginning to accept that approach?
I would say we are in the question was whether the industry is beginning to accept that approach. There's more and more receptivity. I think there's a recognition that we need stakeholders from across the industry to come together, appreciate what those standards are, and to align on what we will hold the real-world evidence accountable for in making changes to trials. And then it really, where the rubber hits the road, is whether government agencies are supportive of where the industry is. And that's the partnership that we're trying to help broker.
Somebody in the back there.
Thanks. Hi, thanks. Does it only work for drugs, or could you, for example, use this platform to evaluate social determinants of health interventions? And if so, who would be the payer?
Well, now that we have the representation from the UK.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Stephen.
You're touching on something that's very important. So at the crux of Aetion's platform is causality, understanding the implication of a given input for a specific patient population. In today's world, we've gotten the most traction with pharma, with medications. As we move forward, thinking about combinations of intervention, of clinical care pathways as an example, and thinking about patient cohorts, not just in terms of the demographics that we use today, like age or chronic illness, but also thinking about social determinants and things that maybe create a more nuanced view of a patient cohort become more and more important. And with this increasing focus that we've had on understanding real-world data, on understanding how best to use it in a reliable way, we are better and better positioned to do just that.
Yeah, I mean, I would piggyback on that. I think more and more, kind of within the zeitgeist, we all agree that, social determinants actually improve outcomes. And there have been some small studies here and there. But ultimately, you should take a large population and do a cohort randomized study, right? Which you can do with the Aetion platform and see if actually social determinants do impact overall cost of care and by how much. right? And my sense is once we start to do these types of population-wide studies on existing populations, then we'll actually start to put a lot of dollars behind social determinants. And so I think, again, it's you have to look at, large health plans and where does social determinants sit on their overall kind of stack of priorities. I think, Medicaid plans, kind of Medicare Advantage plans are starting to kind of think that way. But I think those are the types of studies, those are the types of analyses that you have to do to start to put large share of dollars behind these types of interventions like social determinants.
As well as to get, reimbursement approval at any time in the future. If you don't have the data, go home. Other questions? Yep. The microphone is coming to you.
I love the concept of, really getting at real-world data, and I definitely see the value for pharmaceuticals and biotechnology studies. And I guess my question is, I'm still a little unclear on where your data is coming from. And really, in order to get at those social determinants, you're talking about data sets that pharmaceutical companies pretty much never look at, right? Like, who's getting Meals on Wheels? Who's getting what kind of transportation? I mean, these are, this is really diverse. This is a diverse amount of data. So anyway, I'd like to understand a little more. Where's the data coming from, and how are you collecting it?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're touching on something that is critical. If the data set isn't complete or isn't representing things like social determinants, then we can't take that into account clearly. Generally speaking, we're getting data from claims, from EMR, from patient-reported outcomes, so registry contexts. We have actually explored partnerships with organizations that are looking to attract data and input from patients that get to some of the things that you've just mentioned. That's a work in progress. We're not there yet. And we also need to partner with the government in identifying the kinds of data that would be important for them to require in a Medicare claim, as an example, right? So there's all kinds of ways that the data sets can be improved. The good news and there's so much low-hanging fruit that even with the data we do have, there's a huge impact that we can have, which is sort of an unfortunate reflection of the state of the world today. But it does mean that we can move things forward even as we're trying to create better data sets. And to more specifically answer your question, there are data aggregators out there, right, that are collecting data from health plans, that are collecting data from providers and pooling that together. And those are the data sets that we're often looking at. And we're finding that biopharma clients and payers are becoming increasingly interested in identifying those data sources, and integrating them into their analyses.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, if a payer is an Aetion customer, Aetion will sit on top of the payer's data. So they will know who has been referred, say, to a service like a Meals on Wheels. I think, Carolyn said, closing that loop is going to be really, really challenging. And so we have to kind of do the best that we can with the data that we have. But I think when you're starting to kind of measure an intervention that is not a therapeutic, it's some form of care management, you have to rely on the payer's data, right? And so the outcome is going to be only as good as the payer's data. But you could argue that even the payer's data is not good enough.
Right. So when Anish Chopra and Todd Park were in government, Todd in particular, really opened up the Medicare data. He went bananas. I mean, it's great to see him tell this story because he's jumping up on his toes. But it was like all this data that the government was sitting on, and now it's available. Does this play a role in the data sets that you draw on?
Absolutely. This whole democratization of access to data is wonderful to see, because we want to use the same sources, if you will, right? And there are, as Dan mentioned, there are a lot of technologies out there that are looking to use data in different ways. Recognizing that we have the most comprehensive view of what's happening in a Medicare population, as an example, is important. It's also important to recognize that we have different data sets around the world that can give us insights. So it's fantastic to have the Medicare data opened up here in the United States. We find that if we go to Italy, or we go to France, or we go to Spain, or Japan as an example, that they're collecting different kinds of data. Maybe lab data is integrated in a way that we don't necessarily have access to, clinical outcomes data and the like, patient-reported outcomes, some of these social determinants. So being thoughtful about what's happening best in class around the world, and then bringing that back to what's happening here in the United States.
So it's always challenging, right? Because there are just so many hours in the day. But I mean, what that teed up for me was just this incredible opportunity you have for thought leadership and synthesizing this. Anyway, it's a gig I've had, so.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that there's a lot of open data out there. There's still a lot of data in silos. And there's still a lot of data that, you know, enterprises are sitting on top of that they're not analyzing, right? They just don't know what to do with. Again, they're trying to run their 9-to-5 business, right? They're trying to maintain their revenue sources. And you don't actually necessarily need to dive and mine your own data to kind of do what you've always been doing. Right. So I think there's a huge opportunity for platforms like Aetion to help these large organizations answer questions, right? Using their own data that they've just kind of been sitting on top of, that no one else has access to, that actually can improve the lives of beneficiaries in their population or patients in their provider population.
Yeah, well, I can confirm that it took Charlotte Yeh to do that with claims data from United to learn all sorts of great things. But apparently time is done, so you'll have to come back to find out more about that. So thank you very much, Carolyn, Dan. Thank you, audience, and have a great day.
Thank you.